the first talk to really focus on American Christians. And given the importance of Israel-Palestine, or the Holy Land, to American Christians, as well as their own importance within American politics, foreign policy, and popular discourse, this is a really important perspective to get as we think about the transnational components of the field of Israel or Israel-Palestine studies. I'm also excited to enter this topic through the lens of ethnography, the lens of ordinary people's experience. And there's no one better to give us that kind of perspective than Professor Hillary Kaell. Professor Kaell is an associate professor of anthropology and religious studies at McGill University in Montreal. She's also a faculty fellow with Concordia University's Center for Sensory Studies. I'm really interested to learn more about that. And Yale Center for the Study of Material and Visual Cultures of Religion. She received her PhD from Harvard. As an anthropologist of North American Christianity, her work tracks people's experiences of the divine, the miraculous, and the unseen through material things and sensory experiences. She focuses on aspects of capitalism and consumption, such as tourism, heritage creation, or charity work. She has an interest in how people foster real and imagined connections with symbolically resonant sites far away, such as, of course, the Holy Land, but also the idea of the global church. These themes are central to her 2014 book, Where Jesus Walked, American Christians and Holy Land Pilgrimage, with NYU Press, which we'll be hearing about today. She also has just published recently a second book about Christian globalism through child sponsorship programs, published by Princeton just last year. Her book on Christian pilgrims to Israel-Palestine, or the Holy Land, that we're going to hear about today is the product of 5 years of ethnographic research from before, during, and after Christians' trips. One reviewer wrote of her book that it was written with exceptional narrative grace and critical insight, and is a model of ethnographic research in the study of religion. So without further delay, I'd like us to give a nice welcome to Professor Hillary Kaell.
Thank you so much, Leora. So I'm so pleased to be here with everyone. And a big thank you to Emily, who wasn't able to be with us tonight, and McKenna, and all the other folks at the Stream Center, also who've been working hard to get this talk off the ground, despite a year's worth of delays. So I'm very pleased, and I will plunge right in to sort of a bit of a scene here that will set the stage. So Helen was 67 years old when I met her in 2008. She had the soft, lilting accent of the South, and she was quiet and kind, but also strong. She had raised 4 children on a farm in rural North Carolina, and for 2 years before I met her, she had nursed, waited, and watched as Wally, her husband of 50 years, died of cancer. She remembers, "You're just seeing him waste away, and there's nothing you can do. You want God to do a miracle, but if there can't be a miracle, then you want God to take him and end his suffering. I felt so drained of everything, so lost." Now, the youngest of her children, Sam, built a house on the land the family used to farm just down a gravel path. And during his father's illness, he came over often. He told stories about the trip to Israel that he'd taken the year before with his cousin's church. Helen told me, quote, "As Wally got worse, he really depended a lot on reading in his Bible and thinking about where Jesus was when he was here on earth." Wally and Sam made plans to return to the Holy Land together. Sam brought over a promotional video, which Wally watched on repeat. Wally never got better, but in the weeks after his death, Sam began to talk about it again, urging his mother to come with him. Helen, who had never traveled before, protested that she couldn't fly across an ocean. She protested that she needed to look after Sam's kids, which she did on a regular basis whenever his wife picked up extra shifts. Plus, no one from her Baptist church was going. But slowly, as she sat with Wally's death, the trip began to seem more important. And finally, to her own surprise, she agreed. Now let's keep Helen and Sam in mind because we're going to return to them in a moment. But first, some background about these trips. At the time of my research, a decade ago, about 200,000 American Christians traveled for religious reasons to Israel, Palestine each year. But Christians haven't always gone to the Holy Land, and certainly not Protestant Christians like Helen and Sam. So what's going on? Now, I'm leaving us with an ellipsis here. Before I continue, I'm going to share the screen and start my PowerPoint. So to understand this trend, we need to take a step back in history. As you might already know, there are three major branches in Christianity: Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox. The latter two are the most ancient branches, and both have rich traditions of pilgrimage to sites associated with holy people or images, and notably to sites associated with Jesus from at least the 4th century on. The Roman Christians called it Terra Sancta, or the Holy Land in Latin. Pilgrimage was a common religious practice in the region. You may have just celebrated Passover, one of the great pilgrimage holidays during which Jews trekked to the Jerusalem temple with offerings for God. For the Catholic and Orthodox churches, holiness lingered at a site based on the events or people that had been there. At those sites, you could speak to God, you could ask for help. Like the Jewish pilgrimage festivals, it was also about sacrifice. But Christians didn't take their best fruit or their first lambs to burn upon the temple altar. Instead, they sacrificed themselves. It was the arduous, even deadly journey, the time, money, and energy it took, that was the sacrifice. And in Roman Catholicism, which is important to us because it was the church in the Western side of Europe up until the 15th century. So in Roman Catholicism, this idea of sacrificing oneself on pilgrimage was linked to sin and redemption. Just as Jesus, according to Christian theology, sacrificed his body to redeem humanity of its sin, so could a pilgrim sacrifice his body to expiate his own sin, so that is, to get rid of some of his own sin or the sins of others. Now, fast forward to the early 1500s. Enter Protestantism. Protestants, a loose group of religious protesters, hence the name, right? Protestants were the protesters. So a loose group of religious protesters in Western Europe had a big problem with a lot of things in the Catholic Church, but they had a big problem with the idea of pilgrimage. So one of the things, in other words, they were protesting about the Catholic Church was the link between sin and what they dismissed as works, the stuff that you could do to make up for your sins, like, for example, giving to charity or doing a pilgrimage. Protestants said that only God can forgive sins. There's nothing you can do, only God. Further, said the famous Protestant reformer Martin Luther, pilgrimage, quote, gave countless occasions to commit sin and to despise God's commandments, right? What do you do when you head off on the road away from everyone you know? You despise God's commandments. So that was a pretty harsh evaluation of pilgrimage. In short, anyone who became a Protestant didn't go on pilgrimage. So what changed? To understand, let's jump again, this time to the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, the Holy Land became implicated in how European and North American Christians, including Protestants, responded to the European Enlightenment. Part of this new way of enlightened thinking was what scholars call historical criticism. What they mean is that people began to question whether the history that was recounted in the Bible had really occurred as written. Did Jesus really do all those miracles? Many liberals responded by focusing on the human side of Jesus's ministry, his ethics. And to understand it, they became extremely interested in the details about Jesus's earthly life. Conservatives responded by defending biblical literalism. And they said that the truth of the Bible's narrative, so biblical literalism being that the things that occurred in the Bible did indeed occur as written, it's not just about ethics and Jesus's ministry, but the miracles happened. And in order to make their case for the biblical's narrative being literally true, they said that it could be discerned from the material world, that Palestine's geography and its ancient artifacts seemed to offer scientific physical evidence that biblical events had indeed occurred as written. The places where Jesus walked came to be called a fifth gospel, a type of material proof for verifying or expanding upon what was written in the other four gospels. In other words, both liberals and conservatives suddenly wanted more details about the Holy Land, and this started fueling a growing Holy Land industry. Mid-19th century readers could pore over Life of Christ books, fictional accounts of Jesus's everyday life. There were illustrated Bibles with detailed imaginings of the biblical world. I have one here that's the Child's Picture Testament. So all of these are images that would of things that were in circulation in the mid to late 19th century. So illustrated Bibles, very popular for both adults and children. Victorians also loved natural objects from the Holy Land, such as pressed flowers, and would pass them around, make scrapbooks. Bible atlases also offered maps and information about Jesus's life. The atlases in particular depended on two new and very popular fields of study in the 19th century, biblical archaeology and biblical ethnology. The first uncovered archaeological sites to try to prove that biblical events had indeed occurred as written. The second observed local people, which meant local Arab inhabitants, for proof of how Jesus had lived 2,000 years ago. And so this is an image here that I've just switched to of the most famous American company to make stereoscopic images, Underwood and Underwood. The stereoscope was a favorite sort of parlor game, you might say, where you can look through and there's double images and then it looks like they're 3D when you look through the lenses. So Arab people really became, you might say, an extension of archaeological discoveries. Watching and photographing them, Western Christians believed that they could see living proof of idealized Jewish biblical characters, shepherding, fishing, wearing sandals and robes. After the 1860s, this Holy Land industry converged with a boom in wealth across North America and the UK that gave rise to the first so-called mass tourism, where group tours made leisure travel more affordable. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that a whole bunch of people were going to the Holy Land. Those people who were going to the Holy Land in the late 19th century were still by and large very wealthy and by and large men. But it was the beginning. And importantly, it was no longer just Catholic and Orthodox people who wanted to go. Protestants did too. Across ideological and denominational divides then, American Christians began to conceive of the land as a fifth gospel, and visiting it, an act that would have greatly puzzled any of their Protestant predecessors, certainly, acquired immense spiritual value. Now let's jump historically just one more time, this time to the decades after the founding of the State of Israel. And I hope everyone can see these slides. For me, I'm sort of overlapping the slides, but I hope you can see them. So aircraft developed for the military was repurposed, as you probably know, in the decades after the Second World War, and it was suddenly possible for middle-class people to fly for leisure. American international travel spiked by nearly 700% in the 1950s. This made Holy Land travel much cheaper, notably because it was quicker. And it's in this period that we see the demography of current Christian Holy Land trips emerge, by and large, older and female, and traveling in a group package deal. In other words, people like Helen. Until 1967, most Christian sites were in Jordan, but the Israeli government wanted a piece of the lucrative Western Christian tourism market. In the early 1960s, Israel saturated the US with advertisements and tour offices, inviting hundreds of Christian pastors, or rather leaders, priests, for free on trips to Israel. and they published millions of books for the US Catholic market. So that's why I corrected myself a moment ago when I said pastor, I meant to say priest, and I'll underline that these books were being published for the Catholic market. In 1967, when Israel gained control of the major Christian sites, and this was when Israel gained control of all of Jerusalem, as well as Bethlehem and Nazareth. When it gained control of the major Christian pilgrimage sites, it immediately conducted client surveys, and it discovered a surprising fact. American evangelicals comprised the fastest growing market segment. It quickly changed tactics, and by the mid-1970s, Israeli advertisements appeared regularly in evangelical media as well as Catholic. Although today Catholics still make up more than half of Israel's Christian visitors, they are less important in the lucrative and theologically important, ideologically important US market. In 2011, about 37% of US Christian pilgrims were evangelical and 25% were Catholic. Now, the growth of tourism in this period wasn't only because flights got cheaper and tourism providers did good marketing campaigns. They were also driven by two important theological shifts that I'll mention just briefly. The first has to do with Catholics. In the 1960s, the Vatican created enormous theological changes for the world's billion or so Catholics. What interests us here is first, the Vatican emphasized the importance of Jesus's ministry and Bible reading, which had been less important in Catholicism compared to Protestantism before the 1960s. And so this was helping to promote an interest in visiting the Holy Land. And second, it declared that Jews were no longer deicide. In other words, that they were no longer culpable for the death of God, of Jesus, which is to be deicide. So it declared officially that Jews were no longer deicide, and moreover, that interfaith relations should be encouraged. And this also promoted interest in interfaith relations with American Jews, with American Catholics, and also interest in the state of Israel. I should say, however, that the Vatican had been ambivalent and had been ambivalent right from the founding of the State of Israel, and in fact, in the decades before that as well, about the treatment of Christian Arabs and about Israeli control over key Christian sites, which the Vatican would have liked to have controlled. Today, a fair number of liberal Western Catholics and mainline Protestants have translated some of these ideas, especially about Christian Palestinians and social justice, into a theology of social justice for Palestinians. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that in this talk, but feel free to ask questions and we can discuss it afterwards. Now, the second trend, the theological trend, concerns evangelicals. An idea had been percolating amongst some Protestants since the 19th century. It said that perhaps Christians had not replaced Jews as God's chosen people, which had always been the assumption. Instead, this small group of pastors started saying, perhaps Jews still had a role to play in God's plan. God would fulfill his promises to the Jews, bring them back to Jerusalem, convince some of them to follow Jesus, as a first step in the end times, a civilizational war that would lead to the return of Christ and the final judgment. In 1967, this theology went mainstream amongst US conservative Christians when Israel gained control over Jerusalem. It seemed like a really important sign. And so this theology sort of burst into the evangelical mainstream. Today, many evangelicals have translated these ideas into a strong and very positive view of Israel. And also, among some of them, a yearning to bring the gospel to Jews. This last bit causes ongoing tension with the Israeli public and sometimes Israeli government. The last idea I'll mention is not theological per se, but it's certainly inflected with theological values. In the decades after the founding of Israel, US Christian media portrayed Israelis as hardworking pioneers, likened to, in the words of one Catholic travel writer in 1950, our own frontier days. So our own frontier days referring to the frontier days of the United States. And these new pioneers in Israel were using American-made plows and trucks, symbols of progress and the West. They were cultural and military allies. Today, if one speaks in general terms, US Christian tourists, both Catholic, mainline Protestant, and evangelical, often view Israelis in this light. By contrast, they often view Arabs as not Western. For some evangelicals, fear of Arab terrorism can actually seem to indicate the coming end time, so it can be wrapped up into this larger theological narrative. Okay, so let's move to the present and talk a bit about what it's like on a Holy Land tour. The tours I studied are typical for the Holy Land, and you can see the details on the slide in front of me. In the 5-year study I conducted, I worked with Christians before they left on these trips. I went with them and then I followed up with them afterwards for about a year. In some cases, I followed up for up to 3 years. And in cases where I followed up for a year, I would follow up at intervals of 2 weeks and then 3 months and then 8 months and then a year. Now, most studies don't do this. This is actually pretty unique in pilgrimage studies. I'm not the only person who's done this, but it's not the norm. Most studies focus on people at the site itself. So a researcher accompanies a trip or positions themselves at a pilgrimage site and then asks people questions as they file in and out of the site. Or scholars and also the Israeli Ministry of Tourism do exit surveys, or they survey people after they've returned home. So in other words, no before and no during, but they look at how people think about the trip, usually right as they're leaving Ben Gurion Airport or right after they get home. Organizing the study the way that I did, I was able to see the before, during, and after, and I've organized the rest of this talk along these lines. So the before. I wanted to know, why do Christians take the trip, especially if, like Helen, they've never traveled abroad before? What I found is that most of them, and women in particular, frame the trip as an extension of their already existing role as spiritual expert in their families and communities, where they prayed for others on a regular basis. One reason that pilgrims frame the trip this way is that it's difficult, especially for women who orient their religious practice towards helping others and who are not used to going on expensive vacations, to justify what might at first seem like a self-indulgent vacation. Recall also that for Protestants in particular, there's no official theological justification to do these trips. So it makes this trip look even more like a sort of a luxurious vacation. And even for Catholics, pilgrimage is a choice, not a commandment, like, for example, in another religion like Islam. Viewing this trip as a way to pray for others' spiritual welfare is one way to make sense of this dilemma. But it's also true to pilgrims' experience. They are the spiritual support for many people. The pilgrimage becomes a logical extension of their everyday spiritual work. Now let's return to Helen, mourning the death of Wally, with her son Sam urging her to make the trip. Sam is atypical of pilgrims demographically. He was in his mid-30s when I met him, and a man, both of which are atypical. A farmer like his father, Sam was very introspective and keenly interested in Christian history, which he felt connected him to places, other places, and other kinds of people. Family is also central for Sam, but his marriage had at times been difficult. Helen believed that Sam again felt the pull of the Holy Land in response to problems in his marriage and the stress of his father's death. Sam, however, viewed it differently, and in this way, he is very typical of pilgrims. Like most pilgrims, he rooted his motivations in an indistinct past. So here's Sam talking. I'll just read you a quote from Sam. He said, "When I was a kid, we'd supper together, and my mother and daddy would read Bible stories nearly every night. I must have just always wanted to go." So hymns, Bible atlases, illustrations, dressing up in Christmas plays, films and books about the life of Christ makes it seem like one has just always wanted to go. This particular trip, however, was for his mother. Here's Sam speaking again. He said, I think I had to agree to go, or Mama would never have gone. I can kind of be a crutch for her, and I can help her remember the different Bible stories Daddy would have liked to read, the ones he would have marked in his Bible. Together, they would feel Wally with them. And although Helen had never shown interest before, she surprised herself by agreeing. She said, and this is Helen speaking, quote, "Sam wanted to go again so bad. I said, well, I think I would like to go. Somehow, I think in my own feelings, I was doing something for Wally, something he would have wanted me to do." So here we see Helen talking about how Sam wanted to go so badly, and she felt like it was good and important for Sam, so wanting to do that for him. And at the same time, this was something that she felt like Wally was kind of pushing her to do as well. So again, other people's needs or desires are partly what is moving her towards saying yes to this pilgrimage. When I was on Helen and Sam's trip, I asked the other 27 pilgrims about their motivations too. Many responded like Sam. It seemed to them that they just always wanted to go. But when we got to talking, it turns out that Helen and Sam's more immediate experience was not atypical either. Nearly half of the people on the trip had lost someone close to them in the years leading up to the trip, a spouse, a father, or a friend. And another 20% said that they or someone in their families was undergoing a life transition or was in a rut, and they needed to discern God's will. Often that rut or life transition was actually related to a husband's retirement. So the wife going on the pilgrimage with her husband, or sometimes without her husband, in order to try to discern God's will for the next steps. Women on this trip all fell in, nearly all, other than a couple people among the women, all fell into one of these categories. Men, on the other hand, said they were more likely to be going because their wife was going, or in the case of Sam, his mother, or because they were interested in history and politics. So again, here we see Sam being quite typical actually for how men often respond. This difference is not actually very surprising given how gender roles are perceived in these churches. But again, I want to underline that from Pilgrim's own perspective, it's just as important that they believe that they've just always wanted to go. The Holy Land has been incorporated seamlessly into their connection with the Bible since childhood. Let's move to the trip itself. What do pilgrims encounter? And how does it fit their expectations or not? I'm going to focus on one site right now, the Jordan River. Biblical hymns and images or Christmas decorations are not the only visuals of the Holy Land that precede the trips. Or I should say just imagery of the Holy Land, since hymns are extremely important, and they're obviously not visual imagery, but they still create a sort of sense of what the Holy Land should be. So all of these are not the only ways that people hear about the Holy Land or envision what it could look like. Often, images of the Holy Land are built right into church spaces. Helen's small Baptist church, where she has worshiped for 50 years, has just one artistic adornment, a wall-length baptistry painting depicting the Jordan. So this is my photo of the baptistry painting here in Helen's church, and it's at a kind of a weird angle because I had to point the camera upwards because it is very, very large. This takes up a whole wall, the front wall of the church that you're looking at when you're worshiping during church. The pastor stands in front of this painting. It shows the Jordan as a wide river with fast-moving rapids in the foreground and majestic mountains in the distance. The bright blue water is flanked by a green prairie graced with palm trees. The Jordan, as Helen finally saw it in 2009, looked nothing like the image that she'd known for decades. It's a narrow, slow-moving stream with dark, greenish-colored water and dense foliage crowding the bank. Instead of mountains and waterfalls, there's a large modern tourist complex. And you actually can't really see the tourist complex in this photo that one of the pilgrims snapped because she was trying to avoid it, but it is taking up the whole side of the bank here. And you can see that things are sort of paved over and that there's gateways here to help people down into the water. Today, nearly all American groups, including Helen's, access the Jordan through Yardenit, a kibbutz-run site built to cater mainly to the Protestant market. It can accommodate hundreds of visitors at a time. And the baptism trade is lucrative. The tour group pays admission, plus $1 for bathrooms, $10 for obligatory baptismal robes. Pilgrims file in and out through a gift shop. Prominently displayed at Yardenit are the photos of celebrity visitors. All of them are US televangelists or megachurch pastors, so evangelicals, Pentecostals. Helen didn't comment on the Jordan in particular, but it's a good site to hear divergent views about the trip because it can really rub some people the wrong way. On a Catholic trip I was on, Ed and Nadine, a couple in their mid-70s, looked around with me, commenting. So here's them speaking. It's like a trailer park Disney World. There are all these crazy Christians here, and they're all Americans. And you go through the gift shop, of course. At one point, Nadine urged us to hurry, or we'd miss seeing the evangelical baptism, a ritual that Catholics don't normally participate. Let's not miss the show, she laughed. For Catholics, Yardenit is often the most significant point during the trip when Protestants are in the majority, and the material culture on site is clearly geared to them. When the impression is negative, it's often conflated with and exacerbated by the site's commercialism. The assumption, of course, is that something that is commercial makes it both inauthentic biblically and ineffective spiritually. But other pilgrims feel very differently. On the same trip was Ella, who found the group's reaction surprising. She found a quiet corner filled with greenery, which is similar to the garden at her church where she prays at home. I just loved it, she told me later. I couldn't wait to put my foot in it. I know it was commercialized, but all that stuff faded away and you could just think this is the Jordan River. As is typical, if pilgrims view a site as authentic, meaning that it produces a sense of spiritual presence for them. And this is a really important in terms of the definition of authenticity, and I'll return to it in a moment. So if a pilgrim views the site as authentic, it produces this sense of spiritual presence for them, they will acknowledge all the same facts on the ground. There's a gift shop, there are crowds, it's loud, etc., but they're able to block it all out. All that stuff faded away, as Ella put it. This example tells us that Christians in the Holy Land defy the expectations of scholars in the sense that they define the most authentic places not just as those that are verifiable archaeologically or biblically, but as those where they feel a sense of divine presence. Most often, I found that places that felt the most spiritually powerful were just different enough to evoke where Jesus walked, yet similar enough, aesthetically speaking, to sites where they worship at home. Those are the places where they most often hear God speak. And canny Israeli tour guides can guess a group's preferences and will try to steer them towards those sites. On my trip with Helen, for example, our guide, Gilad, each group has an Israeli guide, as well as a pastor or priest. So our Israeli guide, Gilad, dismissed the Holy Sepulchre as just traditional. Here's the Holy Sepulchre on the left here. It is a Catholic and Orthodox site. So a lot of Protestants find the material culture, the candles, the incense, it's quite dark. There are Orthodox priests. They find it very off-putting. Gilad knew this and he knew we were a Protestant tour. So he immediately told us, oh, it's just traditional. It's not authentic. But, said Gilad, there is one site that is authentic. A crumbling chapel near the church's foundations that remains quiet and undecorated. He offered an archaeological justification, as guides often do when they use the term authentic. He said this is the only section that scientists date to Jesus's day. Now, there's no proof of that, but Gilad, like many guides, tries to highlight places with a feel, in this case, plain aesthetics, he thought would create a sense of spiritual authenticity. The pilgrim I was standing with, Loretta, responded with enthusiasm. Loretta said, quote, I feel more connected here to Jesus. I read and I picture him in the stones wearing sandals, the sand between his toes. And we were indeed standing in a sandy corner. In short, sensory experience matters. Apart from guides and vendors, there is usually little interaction with local people, but they are observed. So I want to take just a moment to note how Jewish Israelis are incorporated into this search for authentic experience, mainly because I thought it might be of interest to people who are listening. So evangelicals who emphasize the importance of Israel are often very interested in seeing Jewish people, particularly since most have never actually met a Jewish person before in the United States. Seeing the modern and thriving Israeli state is often taken as confirmation that God favors his people. It's also confirmation that Israelis are, to their minds, very much like Americans, Western, productive, etc. And I should say this latter bit there, Catholic groups and mainline Protestant groups often say much the same thing. Of course, if they view Americans in a negative light, they tend to view Israelis in a negative light. And Americans in a positive light, they tend to view Israelis in a positive light. Yet, evangelical groups are also, and this is not the case for most Catholic and mainline Protestant groups, evangelical groups are keenly interested in seeing ultra-Orthodox Jewish men praying at the Kotel. This image is widely featured in evangelical missionary tracts unrelated to visiting the Holy Land. A couple generations ago, most Christians believed that the wailing at the Wailing Wall illustrated divine justice. Having committed deicide, Jews were bereft. Today, Orthodox men at prayer are often interpreted as a glimpse into biblical era Judaism, or of course it is not, but it is viewed as a glimpse into what the biblical era was like. Being at the Kotel is also the only time, and I think this is very important, that Jews who are so symbolically and theologically resonant are made visible. Other Israelis, dressed like Americans and doing nothing identifiably Jewish, don't fulfill the yearning to see at least one example of Jewishness in the Holy Land. And if Israelis are understood to be like us and allies, Muslim Arabs are understood as the opposite. This was strongly illustrated to me on another evangelical trip when two Israeli soldiers boarded the bus, as they always do at the Bethlehem checkpoint. One woman was really scared. Though a number of times during the trip, the pastor had clarified that all the soldiers were Israelis, she and a number of others kept talking about how Palestinians had gotten on the bus with guns. There are a few reasons for the mix-up, but ultimately it illustrates the pilgrims' difficulty in equating Israelis, for whom they have such strong affection, and remember this was an evangelical group, with the one moment that they felt threatened by violence. Now, let's return to our Jordan River example. First, as noted, it demonstrated how Christians define authentic or important places. And second, it brings up the constant tension between the modern tourist industry and the theological belief that the Holy Land is a fifth gospel. So the value of the Holy Land as a fifth gospel, remember, said that its value lay in its physical geography being at a basic level unchanged, and therefore being able to verify things from the text, whether it was things about Jesus's ministry or it was things about Jesus's miracles. One can actually walk where Jesus did, and that's an opportunity to hear him better, to understand the Bible better, to feel his presence better. This is really the main reason to do the trip. But this idea is continually disrupted by how modern tourist facilities change the landscape. And modern tourist facilities are actually really important. I mean, this is the reason that these mass tours, these group tours, can go to the Holy Land, can have access to these sites. And it's disrupted again, so it's disrupted through these modern tourist complexes, and it's disrupted again when pilgrims must pull out money, which makes them very uncomfortable when they're trying to focus on spiritual experiences. And we could hear the discomfort as Ed and Nadine are talking about a site being commercialized and using that as a very negative way and kind of a shorthand to describe a site as being, to their minds, inauthentic and unspiritual. The idea that money was afoot, that it was so obvious that this was a site of mass tourism. Now, these tensions are constitutive of the trip. There's no way around them. Without the modern tourist industry, without the money exchanging hands, there would be no possibility for these trips to occur. And yet, without the fifth gospel idea, then these trips probably wouldn't occur because there wouldn't be the theological impetus to go at all. What I found is that ultimately, when sites clash with cherished ideals, pilgrims begin to see the creation of the site and its commercialization. When they feel a connection to the place, they may see it, but they're able to brush it aside. And this also makes a difference after the trip as memories solidify. So let's move to the last part of my talk, which is the after. What is the result after pilgrims return? Memory, as you probably know, is not a static representation of things as they really were. Psychologists show how selection, that is, what one remembers or forgets from any given event, generally stabilizes within a few months of an event, after which time a few remarkably fixed memories remain. In my research, I found much the same. When I visited pilgrims after 2 weeks, they had lots of different memories, lots of different stories, and by about 3 months after the trip, they had really solidified 1 or 2 key memories and stories that they told over and over about the trip. And usually these were moments of deep symbolic import. One pattern I found was that almost every pilgrim in the end viewed the trip as a success. Comparing our conversations before and after the trip, I realized that this is, at least in part, a result of multiple goal setting. And what I mean by this is that pilgrims often enumerate a number of goals before the trip, usually for themselves, but also, as I noted, for a number of other people for whom they are praying or helping on a regular basis. After our return, I found that most pilgrims acknowledged disappointments. This cousin wasn't healed of cancer despite prayers in the Holy Land. A husband wasn't moved to accept Jesus as his savior. The pilgrim didn't understand the Bible any differently. So they acknowledged all these things, but that they downplayed and within a few months even forgot these goals after the trip. Instead, they focused upon what was most closely fulfilled. And thus it always feels like something's achieved, no matter how small. Another major part of the trip concerns souvenirs, both given and displayed. Every pilgrim I met brought things back, sometimes hundreds of small gifts for people. And other times they would create their own ritual spaces with the objects. So let's return to Helen, because she's a good example of this. When we were in the Holy Land, the most important experience for Helen was a worship service that we held in the Garden Tomb, which is a site where Protestants believe Jesus rose from the dead. When we were there, Helen felt Jesus's presence more strongly than anywhere else in the Holy Land, and she also felt the presence of her husband Wally very strongly right at the same time. And it was at this moment that she decided to tell the rest of the group members for the first time that she had lost her husband last year. And she said, quote, but I really feel him here with me, so I know where he is. I know he's with Jesus. So it was really important to her that she felt both of those presences simultaneously in that one place together. She said, I just want to make sure that I'll see them all again in heaven with Jesus, and they're waiting for me to arrive. And Helen, when she said them, she meant all of her kin who had passed on before her, including Wally. So what she did with her souvenirs extended this experience of presence in the Holy Land. Upon entering Helen's 3-bedroom bungalow, one is immediately drawn to a table near her front door. It's a memory shrine. And it includes photos of Wally and a framed copy of his favorite poem. Helen incorporated her souvenirs, I put arrows showing each one, into the display. One is Durer's Praying Hands. This is an olive wood carving of a 16th century picture of praying hands. It's extremely popular with all US Christians, connoting daily prayer, sacrifice, and family. And along with the hands, she had the little olive wood communion cup that we used in the Garden Tomb. The real significance of these souvenirs is lost if we understand them only as evoking past memories or constituting identity. Rather, these are religious artifacts, material evidence of intangible relationships. For Helen, the objects bring Wally and Jesus into her home, such that even if she's busy, she is repeatedly reminded of their realness. Passing by the table, she sometimes pauses for what she calls a visit. She tells them what she's thinking, and she listens for their affirmations and responses. As she summed up the trip for me, Helen forgot about the other goals she had, for example, praying for Sam's marriage, which was even more strained after our return. Instead, she focused completely on Wally. She said, quote, While I was there, it was like Wally was still there with me, but I had something new to look forward to each day. She expressed happy surprise that the trip succeeded in partly filling a hole left by Wally's death, in reorienting her towards something new each day. Pilgrims who express surprise at sudden transformations like this are almost always primed for the changes that result. This doesn't mean to belittle the profound impact of their experiences, but it does illuminate why they are so rarely disappointed. So the trip, if I was to sum it all up, is one part of an ongoing process for these Christians where pre-existing relationships, human and divine, are brought into the world in material ways on the trip and afterwards. And so that is my talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I'll be moderating the audience Q&A now. Please put your questions into the Q&A slot, and I'll try to get through as many as I can, although apologies in advance if I don't make it through everything. All right, so while I give you a chance to put some questions into the Q&A box, I'll just start with a couple of questions. So I'm really interested in some of the sort of financial aspects of this story, like on multiple sides. So I'm interested in whether people generally are funding their own trips, or if there are kind of philanthropic efforts like within the US Christian community to fund trips for those who can't afford to go on their own, which I guess connects to questions about how like class is playing out on these trips. And then on the Israeli side, I'm interested in the extent to which Israel or its tourism ministry is shaping these trips, or, you know, crafting certain kinds of experiences that benefit certain communities or certain categories of people at the expense of others. So yeah, a lot there. You can take this in any direction that you want.
Great, yeah. So the first question is there's a brief answer, which is no, there's no philanthropic organizations. This isn't Birthright. There's no philanthropic organizations that are helping to pay for people's trips. So a lot of people who go on these trips, this is a really big expense, $4,000 to $6,000. It's a huge expense. People have saved up for a long time for the trip. Or sometimes, like in the case of Helen, for example, she had set aside money for Wally's funeral, and then it turned out that there was some money left over from the funeral. And so she actually took this as a sign that she should indeed make the trip, and that Wally was kind of setting it up for her to help her have the money to go. So sometimes it's something like that occurs, you know, money shows up. Sometimes it's that people have been saving a lot. And occasionally, it is that relatives will help. So I have run into many cases where you know, people's children, for example, will pool their resources together and help pay for half the trip so that their mom can go on the trip, for example. And you know, and then for some people, it really runs the gamut, because some people are you know, upper middle class and they're still working, and this is not such a big deal. You know, maybe it's a little bit more expensive than a vacation they might normally take, but it's not so significantly different. So the other question is a much larger question, which is about the economics of what happens on the Israeli side. Absolutely, the Israeli government, so the Israeli Ministry of Tourism, and there's been different iterations of the Israeli Ministry of Tourism ever since 1948 to encourage Christians. Well, not quite since 48, but since, you know, the early 1950s. So shortly after, there's been different iterations of ministries within the government to encourage Christian pilgrimage. So the Israeli Ministry of Tourism, as it's organized right now, is absolutely interested in shaping the trips. Israel, along with a number of other countries around the world, but not all countries certainly, Israel requires that each trip has an Israeli guide, and that Israeli guide is licensed by the Israeli Ministry of Tourism. So at a very, very basic level, who gets licensed is controlled by the Israeli government, which means that certain people are not being licensed. So Palestinians are not being licensed to work in tours where the tours might go across into the Israeli side. Arab Christians have quite a hard time. Basically, Arab Israeli citizens have quite a hard time getting licensed. Now, that said, I haven't personally seen any recent statistics, so I do want to be careful about that. But according to the Arab and Jewish Israeli guides who I met at the time, this is a significant problem. The Israeli Ministry of Tourism certainly does due in part to the fact that they train and license the guides, which directs each group. They do certainly promote certain sites as well and make other sites very difficult to get to in a variety of ways. They do also, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism, try to respond to Christian wants and desires, assuming that it works for them. So, for example, one of the things that I was really interested in, and I hope that some other scholar is tracking this as we speak, I have no idea, but I hope so, is the Israeli Ministry of Tourism's interest in providing experiences for evangelicals to be in contact with Messianic Jews. So people who are of Jewish ethnicity, but are evangelicals. So they have come to believe that Jesus is their personal savior. And this is something that evangelical groups had gotten increasingly excited about for a whole variety of reasons. And at least when I was working, or just after I was working on this project, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism had started responding to that by creating kind of staged displays where you can, like, Messianic Israelis will perform dances or like sing Christian hymns, but in Hebrew. And they started licensing, again, I haven't seen the statistics, but this is according to the Israeli guides who I met, but they had started licensing more Messianic tour guides to try to fill this particular demand amongst evangelicals. So it is absolutely, it's a major industry in Israel, and absolutely the Israeli government through the Ministry of Tourism has a lot of control over where money is being spent, in which hotels, right? Like, you don't stay the night over in Palestine, you stay in Israel, you keep the money as much as possible in Israel. And likewise, on the other side of the border, Palestinians would like as much as possible to make income on these tours and keep people staying on the Palestinian side. There is a lot less infrastructure there, of course. So,
really interesting. So my colleague Annegret Oma in the Germanics department, first of all, thanks you for your wonderful talk, and also notes that for German Christian groups, the remembrance of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, plays a crucial role on these trips. And she's wondering, what role does it play, or does it play a role for these American groups?
That's interesting. It doesn't play much of a role. And I have found, so that's like very interesting to hear. And I would, if we were able to speak in person, I would like to hear a lot more about that, actually. For the American groups, I find that it doesn't play much of a role. And in fact, on the few tours that, so I hung out a fair amount with Israeli guides and to ask them sort of what works and what doesn't work. And so I was not actually, I don't think any of the tours I was on went to any sites associated with the Holocaust, memorials or the museum, but some tours do. And guides say that it's a very hard sell, that this is often not something that groups are very interested in. And this is one place where the Israeli Ministry of Tourism would really like these groups to be more sensitized to this and to go to these sites. That's not always, if you're on a short tour that's basically not the priority for these groups. The same with like visiting the Knesset or something like that. That's not the priority for most of these groups. That said, mainline Protestants, so I'm not sure if your colleague was speaking about evangelical groups or not, but mainline Protestants and Catholics tend to be sometimes a little bit more interested in having those kinds of discussions while they're on the trip. It depends a lot on the group. I would say overall, these groups are not interested in that.
Thank you, it's super interesting. Here's another question from someone who didn't put their name down, asking you to describe the Christian groups who are forming a Justice for Palestine agenda and what distinguishes them and what practices in terms of tourist practices are associated with this agenda.
So I'm not sure if the person had a specific group in mind, like an agenda sounds quite like there's a lot of organization behind it. So I looked at what I would call typical groups in the sense that they weren't associated with particular organizations. They were being run by churches or run by a parish. But that said, some of the groups that I was on were very much concerned about social justice for Palestinians, but they weren't going as part of a sort of organized group in that respect. But one example, one group that in the book I talk about mainly as representative of a group that at least a minority of people on that group were very, very interested in, specifically actually Muslim-Christian dialogue. This was a Catholic group out of New England. And a number of people in that group had already been involved in Catholic-Muslim dialogue. And as a result of that, had been very interested in the Palestinian cause. And this is something that also, I should say, the Franciscans, who are for Catholics, they are the protectors of the Terra Sancta and are the Franciscan custos, it's called the custodians, are mainly often the guides. They can even be the local guides. That's actually the one exception. The Israeli Ministry of Tourism allows Franciscan guides who are not Israeli citizens to take groups around, and there doesn't need to be an Israeli licensed guide on those buses. The reason for that is that the Ottomans had let them do it, and so Israel decided they had to let them do it as well in 1948. So they basically got grandfathered in. But to make it a long story short, this group was very much interested in the way that the Franciscan custos often talks about Christian Arabs, Palestinian Arabs. It's featured on their website, it's featured in lots of their reading materials, and talks about this specifically in terms of social justice. And the language of social justice most often used by Anglicans and Catholics is a language of living stones. And then that language, that social justice is Catholic language, living stones for the Palestinian cause is Anglican language, but those two kind of phrases get picked up by Christians who feel strongly about the Palestinian cause, no matter what church they're from. So you hear that phraseology a lot. And what it refers to, living stones, is the idea that theologically speaking, you actually want to move away from biblical archaeology, which, by the way, Catholics did a lot of biblical archaeology, and focus instead on the idea of living churches and supporting the actual people who are there in those churches. And so things that go along with that is maybe spending more time in Bethlehem, for example, trying to spend money. Actually, there's often an economic component, trying to spend money on the Palestinian side of the border. So buying your souvenirs on that side rather than the Israeli side. Also spending time maybe seeing there's Palestinians have created recreation biblical times villages. You can go to that, for example. What we did in this particular tour is we went to go visit a town that is a Palestinian Christian town that's quite famous for having made a CD with a children's choir. And so we went to go visit that town because a few people on the bus had the CD and were very excited about the place where these children came from. But again, they spent money while they were there, and the idea was to spend more time on the Palestinian side. So there's both a theological justification as well as often the attempt to create social justice through recognizing that this is an economic activity and trying to even out where the money is being spent.
Really interesting. There's a couple of questions that I'm going to give at the same time that pertain to some of the history you presented at the very beginning of the talk. So David B. is interested in your explaining further the major push for Protestants to engage in Holy Land tours around the 19th century. Whether there, maybe I'll add, whether there's other aspects beyond this fifth gospel, or what are the context in which that fifth gospel idea came to be. And then I'll also add Professor Alan Dowdy's question. So he says that he's actually worked with pilgrims' accounts from the 19th century, and their reactions were much more negative, among other things. And he's hoping that you could expand on the comparison between these earlier accounts and the more contemporary ones.
Well, so I don't know if I'm allowed to ask for, there's not really a back and forth, but just clarification about which pilgrims he's talking about and in which era in the 19th century. I'd be curious.
Maybe Alan can put that into a new question and I'll
Okay, all right. Well, so if he wants to give me a little more, then that would be very helpful. I mean, certainly, you know, like a famous kind of tongue-in-cheek account is Mark Twain, who does go to the Holy Land. But Mark Twain is famously irreverent. And so, you know, he says things like, my illustrated Bible said the grapes would be as big as a person, and they're just tiny little normal grapes. You know, so Mark Twain is like not impressed by the Holy Land. But I'll get back to that in just a moment. As far as the 19th century goes, so, I mean, one thing I didn't mention was the interest in missions. So the first missionaries from the United States, foreign missionaries, so Americans who are going abroad to missionize. The first missionaries date back to the 1810s, well, 1812 anyway. And the first to go to the Holy Land are in the 1830s. So it's a pretty early place because of its theological significance, where Protestants are hoping to be able, American Protestants are hoping to be able to convert local people. And they don't have significant success at all, but they are sending back you know, descriptions, and they're sending back you know, sort of details about where they are. So there is that aspect that I didn't mention because I actually don't think it's quite as important as this larger, as I called it, Holy Land industry that's being produced really in the latter half of the 19th century. That is part of a larger Victorian parlor culture, you might say. So, you know, it's once photographs become possible, then Victorians are trading these postcards and these stereoscopic images and these kinds of things. And also these, you know, things like illustrated Bibles become much, much more popular. And these novels. So novels become more popular in the 19th century just in general and amongst Christians. And so novels about sort of kind of imagining Christ's life become quite popular, and then give way in the 20th century to films about Jesus as well. That usually use the United States as the backdrop, of course, like they're filmed in Utah or wherever the case may be as the Holy Land. To clarify, so I'm not sure what it was precisely that that wasn't clear initially, but I do want to emphasize that all of this discussion about Jesus's life and the place where Jesus lived really does come out of a larger discussion about the Bible itself. So this is a really, the 19th century is kind of a really contentious period about the Bible, you might say, because you really do have, you know, this elite voice generally elite, but nevertheless, is scandalous and getting a lot of airtime, as it were. No airtime, but is getting a lot of play, which is saying, the Bible is not literal. It's a fairy tale. I mean, it can maybe offer you something in terms of its stories, but it really is stories. And so this threat, you might say, to the way to understand the Bible in this period propels, as I noted, liberals and conservatives. It propels them in slightly different ways, but it propels both of them to try to figure out how the Bible is going to continue to be important to them. And the Holy Land plays a major factor in this. And I should say fifth gospel is a term that was used in the 19th century, but it's not like 19th century people were running around calling the Holy Land the fifth gospel all the time. I quite like that expression because I think it really helps give us a sense of how the land itself was viewed as an extension of the text, and that's why the land itself was important in the 19th century in a new way, because it was a contentious period for trying to understand the text, for trying to understand what you get out of this text. And focusing in on Jesus's life and his ethics was one way to do so. Getting details about why exactly it's important that the Samaritan did this particular thing, and going to the Holy Land can help you understand where those fault lines were in that period to better help you understand Jesus the man on the liberal side. Or, as I said, on the conservative side, doing things like unearthing, Megiddo and saying, aha, here's Armageddon, this is where it's going to happen, right? So on both sides, this is offering a way to grapple with these new ways to talk about the Bible and the text. So the other question was about negative portrayals. So I would say, I don't know if there was a follow-up, like a more specificity.
You just specified by saying that they were both American and European, of kind of a more religious bent than Mark Twain.
Okay, so I mean, I would say that in my reading, but I must say that in the end, this project ended up being very ethnographic, very contemporary in nature. But I did start off thinking it was going to actually be about the 19th century. So I read everything I could get my hands on in the Harvard Library, which is actually quite a lot of 19th century travel narratives from the Holy Land. And I would say that, to my mind, what I recall is that actually it's quite much like contemporary pilgrims, quite split in the sense that you'll have one person who in the travel narrative is saying, oh my gosh, this garden was so spiritual and I loved it, because it fits with their preconceived notion of what they believe should be the Holy Land. And then over and over again, extremely negative portrayals, particularly of any place where Eastern Orthodox worshipers are in the majority. So, for example, you have Protestants who go and attend the Easter celebrations at the Holy Sepulchre, where Eastern Orthodox people have this celebration that's called the Holy Fire, and they're passing fire from baton to baton. I've never seen it myself, but there they are, and they say things like, I could see Satan at work. Like this is like very, very strong language to describe what they're seeing. So again, in my reading of these 19th century texts, it really is very much an attempt to distinguish the sites that they view as being occupied by the wrong kinds of Christians who are doing the wrong kinds of things that essentially desecrate a site, versus sites that they view as legitimately, authentically spiritual, even if they're not using the language of authenticity, which is quite 20th century language. And sometimes, like I mentioned, the Garden Tomb, that was discovered as the site where Jesus rose from the dead by an English Protestant in the mid-19th century, General Gordon, precisely because he found the Holy Sepulchre just so horrible that it just could not be true that this was the place, because there were just too many Orthodox and Catholic people there. So he discovered over on a hill a little bit further away discovered a whole new site where Protestants could go that would be built by like a Victorian garden.
Amazing. This is just so fascinating. I want to take you out to dinner and ask you lots more questions, but we'll have to pretend and take a rain check on that. Fortunately, we're at the end of our time, and even though there are several more questions that I could have asked.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were going to 8:30.
Oh, well,
no.
I was
Okay.
told that, well, yeah, I was given instructions that we needed to end at 5:15.
Sorry.
Let me just share some of the questions, and you may not have a chance to answer them, but just to give a sense of what some people were asking about. So, so one question dealt with how Israeli people generally view American tour groups to the extent that they encounter them, right? People other than tour guides. Another person was interested in why you chose Helen as the representative pilgrim, and how much variation was there in experiences. There were also questions about the Protestant versus Catholic itineraries, where they go, and whether the US experience is representative of or comparable groups coming from other Christian or majority Christian countries in Europe or elsewhere. So fortunately, we don't have time to—
Well, excellent questions. So all I can do is affirm that those are great questions.
But yeah, I hope folks will check out your book called Where Jesus Walked. And yeah, hope to stay in touch. I just want to end by saying that, again, remind folks of the event that was scheduled for next week. Also an event rescheduled due to the pandemic about ghetto, the history of a word. You can see a slide up there now. And I also want to remind folks to save the date for the 2021 Strom Lectures with Julia Watts-Belzer, a professor at Georgetown University, which will also take place online on May 25th, my birthday, and May 27th. So with that, very abruptly, we will now end the webinar. Thank you all for coming.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want.
Bye-bye.